A very good evening, a warm welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine, presented by Pick and Pay, and coming to you from my friend George's house, because my house, like the rest of my neighborhood, is bereft of power. Thank you, Eskom. Thankfully, George has a generator and he's not home, and I've got a key, so don't tell him I was here and raiding his kitchen a little later on. Welcome to the show. Welcome to a week that is as busy as ever at the moment. There's so much happening in the wine world at the moment. In just a minute or two, I'll run you through where I was a little earlier on today, and we'll also through forward to where I will be this weekend and next week, because there is so much happening in celebration of the wine world. But celebration is key to our show today, because we raise a glass to somebody we've raised a glass to before in memory, one of the greats of South African wine, of South African wine making, of just the South African wine industry, and one of the loveliest people the industry has been able to lay claim to over the years, Duimpie Bayly, who sadly said goodbye to us after a wonderful, colourful, warm and successful wine career. And he is being remembered in a rather special way, and one I think Duimpie would greatly approve of. A wine that you'll certainly have heard of, but this time released in the context of his memory and leading into some more memories to come. An exciting time in terms of chronicling the history of wine in South Africa. And so today I've got three of the more celebrated voices in South African wine who will be talking about Duimpie Bayly, his legacy, and this tribute wine. And one of those will be talking about South Africa's favourite wine festival that makes its return, long overdue, at the back end of next week. It's a grand wine carnival. There are a few tickets still left, and we'll find out what it is, where it is, and how you can come along and be part of it in just a moment. First up, though, let's have a quick look at some of the latest wine news. Well, this is some news from the wine sales department, not bottles, but whole estates. Grand Chai de France expanding their footprint. I think they own, I might be wrong on this, I think they own 68 wineries or vineyards in France. I'm sure my guests will be able to clarify that for me. And they have decided that South Africa is their next port of call, and they have put down the money to take over Neertlingshof. It's been a question as to what might happen with Neertlingshof, and we now know it is under French ownership, a big investment, an important investment, and an investment I'm quite excited to see, because Neertlingshof does have a rich history, but a little bit of investment, a little bit of support will not go astray. And it's nice to see big wine players internationally taking South Africa quite so seriously as a destination for investment. So an exciting time for Neertlingshof. I imagine, as often happens with these situations, we won't see any sudden and dramatic change, but there will be an influx of investment, and we will hopefully see that Neertlingshof name glowing and shining once again as the French team from Grand Chai de France come in. So watch this space. Exciting times for Neertlingshof. Also, watch out for next week. Now, it says there 26, 27, and 28. I think that 26 is already sold out, which leaves you with 27 and 28 to get down to Winex. This was the first ever wine festival I ever went to, and it's one, if you haven't been to, gives you a wonderful opportunity to get a snapshot of such a wide expanse of the South African wine industry. Tickets are between 195 and 330 Rand each. 195 Rand gets you in, 330 Rand gets you sitting in a jacuzzi with Michael Fridjhon with a vintage glass of wine. So if you want to get those tickets, head online and you can go and get them. They are still available, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to taste so much fabulous wine. That is web tickets, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I'll double check that now. But it's a really cool afternoon, really cool evening, a lot of fun, and just some seriously good wine presented by some seriously good wine people. So if you're at a loose end Thursday or Friday next week, we'd love to see you down at Winex. I shall be down there on Friday, and I am rather excited. And then this is a brand new range. And I did this earlier on today from Spear, their natured organic range. And you always have a look at these a little carefully. Is this the real deal, or is this a slick bit of marketing to tap into the organic, sustainable, let's put on our sandals, wash down our lentils with some wine we believe has been made at full moon? But this, I think, is the real deal from Spear. They've been doing this since 2010, making organic wine, but they've put the foot down on the accelerator a little, and they're really trying to turn around what they're doing and ensure that everything they make is sustainable, not just on Spear, but the other farms, the other territories that they either own or take grapes from. And I caught up with Johan, the head winemaker, a little earlier on, and here's a glimpse of what's to come on a future episode of the magazine show from Dan Really Likes Wine. Who said there aren't beautiful places to drink wine in Johannesburg? This is the Stables. It's in the Westcliff area, and it's where I find myself along with Johan from Spear. And we've been drinking some organic wine that throws out any notions you might have that because it's organic, it's not quite as good. And it's part of a story that Spear are putting together to change the perception of wine, but also change how they're approaching their broad operation and what an operation it is. Look out, coming up soon on Dan Really Likes Wine. That conversation, 4 lovely wines to taste, one great winemaker to taste it with, and a pretty good spot to do so in. So there we go. Thank you, Johan. That's a great spot there. Just down the road from Westcliff is the Stables, and that was earlier on this afternoon. So look out for that coming up. You'll also be able to see footage from Winex because we'll be filming there next week because it is returned, and that is part of today's show. And that is why Michael Fridjhon is a very welcome returnee to the show. He's not only talking about Winex, though, he's also helping us to celebrate the life and times of Duimpie Bayly in the form of a really cool release that pays tribute to the great man. And to join Michael is another Michael from Deventer, who heads up the Vinotech, one of my favorite places to go and visit, a capsule of old wine in South Africa, and Bennie Howard, who you might have seen, I read a column about it on Wine Mag the other day, gave me such a great evening during the course of Cape Wine. So let me welcome our trio of guests, Michael, and Bennie. Welcome, guys. Lovely to have you all on, and thank you so much for joining us. Very exciting to have Winex back, and Mr. Fridjhon, we'll talk about that a little later on in the show. But for now, the opportunity to celebrate somebody who we've celebrated on the show before, but now to do so with a very special bottle of wine. Before we talk about the wine itself, Michael, amongst many things, Mr. Fridjhon, you are a wine historian, and you know the characters of South African wine and what they've meant to South African wine more than so many. Why, for you, was Duimpie Bayly such an integral figure in South African wine?
I mean, that's a really detailed question in one sense. He bestrode the age. He came into the wine industry in the effectively early 1960s, and he was with us until last year. So he oversaw in many ways the transformation of the industry from essentially quite small, slightly rustic, an era in which most wine was sold in returnable glass, and right into the era of the estate wine system, the wine of origin system, the boom in exports, which followed democratic South Africa in 1994. And he was an integral part of every one of those stages. He was part of the delimitation commission that dealt with the appellation system, but he was also hands-on in making those unbelievable classics that we taste from time to time amongst the survivors of the 60s, and which are wines which I have to say are benchmarks and beacons for the wine industry today. So he really was the one figure that really bridged a number of eras, was a key player in them. He completed his studies and his training at the University of California on the Davis campus. So he really was completely technical, completely specialized, whereas many of his predecessors were artisanal winemakers. He really understood the science of wine, but he had an extraordinary common touch. He was able to think wine as the common man, and his wines were all accessible and yet age-worthy. So over and above the fact that he was an extraordinary human being, a great friend, a loyal friend to everybody in the industry, and a real key player. He was the single, I guess, most pivotal figure over an almost 60-year period.
And that's not a small statement to make, the single most pivotal figure in a 60-year period. And that's why he is being celebrated in a number of ways, starting with this very special bottle of wine that I'm going to unveil in just a moment. Bennie, tell me about Duimpie the person. Michael's sketched out what an important role he had in the wine industry and touched on Duimpie the person. But tell me about your friend, Duimpie.
Yeah, Duimpie is one of those extraordinary people that I think wherever he went around the world and in South Africa touched everybody's lives when it comes to wine. I think the greatest asset that we had in Duimpie is that he lived wine, and he had always something positive to say about wine. That to me is one of the greatest assets that we have in the wine world, is that we can recognize all the good things in wine. And he never ever said something bad about a wine that I was present. And he and I have attended over the years many celebrations and many tastings and many events. And on top of that, he was a guy that distributed his knowledge of wine to everybody. If you speak to winemakers, if you speak to people in the industry, if you talk to people in the trade, he was always keen to give his knowledge free to everybody. He assisted winemakers to find other jobs in other cellars. He could speak about the wines from virtually every cellar in South Africa, because if you've been in the industry that long, some of the older cellars were part and parcel of his young livelihood. But I think most of the younger wineries grew up in front of him, and he could share his knowledge and his passion to all those people. On top of that, he was a friendly, easygoing, happy person, a person that I think also showed that one should enjoy life. Therefore, he was naughty, told many jokes. Can't always remember all those jokes that he told, but he could dish them up at virtually any gathering of anybody drinking wine, wherever the case may be. And on top of that, he loved good food. I think that is most probably one of the greatest moments in one's life, if you have a good bottle of wine and you can share it with somebody or with more than one person over a great platter of food. And whether it was simple food or, some special food or five-star cuisine, Duimpie could love eating and drinking and talking at the same time. A fantastic people's person.
I have just one memory of Duimpie in person because I only got to meet him once. He shared a couch with me. In fact, our introduction was live on a broadcast, and he just exuded warmth and charm and a genuine curiosity in what I was doing and what I was presenting. And it was so much fun in such a short space of time. You guys will all have so many memories. Before we jump over to the wine Finitech, Mr. Fridjhon, is there a particular memory of Duimpie, one of the experiences that you guys shared together that you remember with particular fondness?
The answer is there isn't one single one. There are a few, obviously, many bottles of wine, many discussions around wine. He used to come to the old wine tastings that I used to host every year before the judging of the Trophy Wine Show, where we assembled red wines 25 years and older, white wines 15 years and older. And when it came to a discussion around some of those wines, because the wines that we served at that old wine tasting went back to the 1950s, we almost always kind of gravitated towards Duimpie, because if we needed to know a little bit about how the fruit might have been handled, his guess was better than our guess if he didn't actually know for sure. And in many cases, of course, he did. But I have to say, one of my abiding memories of Duimpie is that he had the most extraordinary fear of flying. And it's something that he finally overcame by doing a course at the University of Cape Town that was designed for people who have such an anxiety about flying. And I think that made it possible for him to board an aeroplane without having flattened, as he used to say, a bottle of mainstay in order to make his way to the steps of the plane. And on one occasion, we were together in the Kruger Park, and we had been promised something slightly bigger than a single prop plane to get back to Johannesburg. And the weather wasn't great. And at 8 o'clock in the morning at Skukuza Airport, Duimpie's only way of approaching the possible flight, and he really did think he was flying in a Global, which is a proper jet and relatively, I suppose, inured to the weather, was to say to the barman at 8 o'clock in the morning, "Do you have any mainstay?" And he said, yes. He said, "Well, give me a bottle." And the man gave him a miniature. And he looked at the miniature and said, "That's really not going to help." So he lined up a whole number of miniatures of mainstay, and he did absolutely knock them off. And at that moment, the plane arrived, and it was a Beechcraft. It was very small. And under ordinary circumstances, he would never have boarded it. But firstly, he'd had the drink, and secondly, he had to board. So we kind of just pushed him into the plane, and the plane took off, and we had terrible weather. And when we landed at Lanseria, and I really won't describe what happened in the plane when it hit an air pocket and dropped, I guess, 1,000 feet or so, and whatever was in the plane was stuck to the ceiling. As we landed at Lanseria, he scuttled down the stairs and he kissed the ground at the bottom of the stairs. He really had this desperate anxiety about flying. He knew it was irrational, and he didn't mind making a fool of himself because he just couldn't cope with what was entailed. When I asked him what the cause was, he said he was always anxious, but he'd been on a plane where an engine had exploded or collapsed, and that had really thrown him past the comfort zone. But his solution was to do exactly what he did most days of the week, have a glass of something good in his hand and face the future with resolute good faith.
That's a wonderful recollection, and I love the fact that one of the wine-making greats of South Africa got by his flights with some cane. My wife would definitely approve of that. He is being celebrated by us today, but also by a very special release of an iconic South African wine. And I've got something to show you about that. But before I do it, I want to introduce our third guest, who's part of one of my favorite spots in the winelands. I've managed to smuggle myself in once or twice, and it's as much a museum as it is a wine repository. It is the Vinotech, and it is the home of so much of South Africa's great older wine. Michael van der Velde, lovely to have you on the show. Welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine. Give us, if you will, a little bit of the backstory of the Vinotech, how it came about, and what sort of wine you now get to preside over.
Thank you very much. Yes, very exciting to be on your show. Basically, these two elements to what I do is the first leg is I manage the Vinotech that was established in 1984 by Anton Rupert and Julius Laszlo at Bergkelder. So this is a business where we bottle mature wines for customers and consumers alike, giving them a space to mature wine to a proper maturation age where it can be enjoyed by all. And on the other side, we look at the tabernacle, the very famous tabernacle at Armtas, which is an underground cellar and wine library with wines dating back to 1791. Wines that was put away by the man Duimpie himself, and without his involvement, we might not have had this fantastic collection of iconic wines, iconic vintages, Chateau Libertas from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and onwards, Zonneblooms, and all those wines he so dearly loved. And part of that is we decided to honor, do something in his name, or to honor him and his legacy that he's left behind. And one of the ways we're doing that is releasing this Chateau Libertas Magnum that you'll probably show in a short while. And why we're doing this is we've committed some funds to a very special project in collaboration with the University of Stellenbosch, where they will be restoring the historic Welgevallen farm buildings in the Stellenbosch, farm buildings and cellar in Stellenbosch. And part of this whole new development, we are hoping to create a Duimpie Memorial Center that will have a collection, transcription, and preservation of knowledge, history, storage, and academic inputs involving the entire wine industry, not only from Stellenbosch, obviously. And the archived material will be housed in the center to be accessed not only by members of the wine industry, but also the public.
All right, lots of information coming in there in one go. We'll come back to the second half of that a little later. But the first part I wanted to have a look at is this Chateau Libertas, as Michael has referenced. It is one of South Africa's best known wines, and it's a wine that's not always given the full appreciation that it deserves. And I'm sure my three guests will concur with that when I ask them in a moment. But we're going to see it in a new light as it comes out in this Duimpie Bayly celebration issue. So let's have a quick look at what has been put together and what makes this Chateau Libertas in honor of Duimpie Bayly quite so special.
I got involved with Chateau Libertas before I actually started at the winery. When we were students, we used to drink a lot at the old Grand Hotel on the corner of Dorp and I think it's Bird. Started in 1962. Unique. The best wine that I've tasted in my life, South African wine, Chateau Libertas.
We are launching a memorial magnum as a tribute to late Duimpie Bayly, who passed away last year.
There was an idea to honor him and keep his memory alive, and no better way to do that than with linking it to Chateau Libertas' 90th birthday.
I really think this is an important initiative, in part because it celebrates the life and the role that Duimpie Bayly played in terms of the modern Cape wine industry.
We're launching it on Duimpie's birthday, which is the 12th of October. And the beautiful part of this is that this magnum will carry the original label of Chateau Libertas.
A man who loved wine to be a beverage to be enjoyed. He wasn't one of those people who took wine, set it on a pedestal, looked at it and didn't pull the cork. And if we're going to produce a wine that in that sense represents his achievement in the industry, we have to look at a wine that is going to be drinkable with a view to keeping, but also with a view to enjoying, not keeping it in the cupboard for your heirs to worry what to do with.
Well, I have with me here exactly that. It is the Memorial Magnum, which I'm going to unfurl for the first time. Fontaine really likes wine. And there you go. There's a chance to have a look at the Magnum. It looks magnificent. It's just dripping with history and heritage. And I'm so happy it's been done this way. Bennie, tell me a bit about the story in terms of bringing this together. Who had the idea? Why you guys thought this was the wine to do for Duimpie and how you produced this particular wine.
Well, it was an absolute joint effort from everybody. I don't think we can say it was just one single person. There were so many people that said there must be a special occasion for Duimpie and obviously for Chateau Libertas, because that was the wine that he was so fond of. I remember how many years he and I would go to functions where we were asked to bring a special bottle of wine, and it just so happened that we both would bring a bottle of Chateau Libertas, and the vintage was 1982, because that was one of the exceptional vintages of Chateau Libertas, and there were beautiful magnums that were also released of that particular year, and we often brought a bottle from each of our cellars, and we would compare notes and say, yeah, the wine is still brilliant and still beautiful and whatever. So I think it was really a joint effort, but all the credit must go to Stell, to Richard Rushton, the MD, right through to everybody who was involved in making sure that we are going to have a very special magnum. I'm personally very fond of magnums. I think it's a great way to mature wine and also to open at any dinner or any occasion. So magnum, yes, that was the great idea, and then to make something that was true to what Chateau Libertas was over the years. It was an easy drinking wine, but still with the potential to mature for a very long time. And I think that balance is very important if you talk about wine with a legacy like Chateau Libertas, but also of a person like Duimpie, who also shared the ageability of our wines with so many people, not only in South Africa, but around the world. So the idea was to create a Chateau Libertas that would last, but a Chateau Libertas that would be ready to drink now on the release date, which was his birthday a week ago. And I must be honest, after tasting it for the first time last week, after our deliberations earlier in the year with the winemakers and with the rest of the team, it came together beautifully. I think the wine is elegant, it is juicy, it is rich, it is complex, it talks to you. It goes great with food that we had the day at the restaurant. It is just an all-in-one wine for me. And that to me is a perfect example of how I would like to remember Duimpie as well, because the wine is to me like Duimpie was. And I'm very happy to say that there will be more than one bottle of this particular labeling in my cellar to mature and to enjoy in the next few years.
And to enjoy not just in celebration of Duimpie, but also because of the role you played, Bennie, in putting it together. Michael, tell us a little bit about this project, about orchestrating it, bringing it together, all the moving pieces. In the video, we saw a lot of very well-known people in the industry. Albert from Durbanville Hills was there. I saw Christian Eads, as well as obviously Bennie and Michael Fridjhon. How did you pull it all together? How did this work? And how did you settle on this as what was going to be the magnum that we now take delivery of?
I think looking back at it, it must be one of the easiest projects we've ever done, because everything just went so smoothly. There was absolutely no resistance from day one in anything we requested, asked, and wanted to do for this memorial or tribute magnum. So it was absolutely a pleasure to be on this project, because everyone was on the same page from day one. We knew it probably had to be Chateau Libertas, as Bennie said. It had to be a magnum, and then we wanted to stay true to the original recipe, which would have had Cabernet and Cinsault and occasional vintages, something else. But we decided ultimately on the Cabernet Cinsault blend for easy drinking, but also for a touch of maturation, because that's always important for us. So, and I'm also glad to say that the first hand-numbered 18 magnums will go into our tabernacle, and there will be something very special planned for the years to come with those magnums. Hopefully they'll they'll age gracefully, just as Duimpie did over the many years he served in the industry.
Now, there are only 2,800 of those, the first 18 in the tabernacle. There might be some in the project that Michael has already alluded to. Let's jump over to Michael Fridjhon then and talk about this wine, Michael, in the context of South African wine history. If I go back to would have been 4 years ago now, when both my wife and I celebrated our 40th birthdays. We are a 78 vintage, and probably the nicest wine I had that year was a 1978 Chateau Libertas, which we served at her birthday dinner. And then one or two people who raised an eyebrow, what's Dan doing serving Chateau Libertas? And then they tried it and realized exactly why I was. And it's a wine, usually Cabernet Sauvignon Cinsault. This is exactly that, that was the mainstay of a lot of the red blends of that time. And so not just remembering Duimpie through a wine with his name on the label, but also, Michael, using a wine that speaks to an era of South African winemaking that, as we know now, has aged so well and has served as a time capsule of that 70s, 80s period of South African winemaking.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very interesting that until the 1980s, there was no Merlot in South Africa. So if you had Cabernet, the obvious variety to blend it with was Cinsault. Cinsault was widely planted. In the early 1980s, it still represented 12% of the national vineyard, which probably meant that there were at least 4 hectares of Cinsault for every hectare of Cabernet or any other red variety. It was the dominant red variety. And I think for that reason, it was under-respected. So the moment Merlot became available, a lot of the growers, a lot of the estates simply grubbed up their Cinsault vineyards and planted Merlot, thinking that it was the next best thing in, wine. What we discovered is that, firstly, Merlot doesn't necessarily perform perfectly in South Africa. Secondly, at the time, the clonal material wasn't ideal. And so where Merlot was substituted for Cinsault, the wines were less interesting, less complex, less fresh, and strangely enough, less age-worthy. And with that discovery, there's now a renaissance for Cinsault. More and more people are replanting it, and any of the old vine vineyards that are about are being preserved in an almost manic way. I think the oldest official vineyard left in South Africa is one in Wellington, planted 118 years ago, and it is Cinsault. So those old bush vine Cinsauts were wines of extraordinary ease, elegance, concentration, and freshness. And if you then added just a little bit of Cabernet to them, the Cabernet was able to dominate the blend, give it real character, and it could still age. So, I mean, all of us in this group had Chateau Libertas 50, 60 years old, and they go on forever. I remember a tasting that Bennie organized probably 20 to 30 years ago, where we had a couple of bottles of the 1940 Chateau Libertas. Each bottle was different. It was wartime glass. The color of the glass was different. But those bottles, 50 or 60 years old at the time, were in remarkable condition, had aged beautifully, had really refined mouthfeel, tannins, nuances, flavors. It's a grape we should never have abandoned, and it's a grape that's now on its way back. So in composing this blend for the Duimpie Bayly Memorial Magnum, the original samples that were brought to the blending team, of which obviously I was one, so was Bennie, so was Christian Eads, included all sorts of things that are used very much in the current release of Chateau Libertas. And we were very clear. We wanted it to be authentically the style of wine that Duimpie would have been making in the 1960s. And that really meant Cabernet and Cinsault, with Cinsault and Cabernet. And we looked at what was available in Stellenbosch fruit from just those two varieties. And then having composed what we thought was the appropriate blend, we really obviously had to defer to Andrea Freeborough and the winemaking team at Distel to make it happen to the blend that we had both made up from their tanks, but also specced in terms of how we wanted to see it polished and finished before it went into bottle. And the first time I tasted the bottled version was last week at the launch of the wine. And I must say I was really, excited. Impressed would imply that I had low expectations, having been involved in the project. But it really was exciting to see how well that wine had come together. And I really do think that there is something in that Duimpie Bayly Memorial Magnum that has the length and the runway that it needs to emulate the achievement of those ancient Chateau Libertas wines that are real beacons and benchmarks of the Cape wine industry of a bygone era.
I had wanted to chat about one of those. I haven't tried the 1940, but I did get to drink the 1967 a couple of weeks ago in the company of Bennie Howard in a brilliant evening with Michael van Deventer and the Vinotech team, where we drank some extraordinary old South African wine that was still fresh and lively and full of intent. Bennie sadly has had to depart. He's a busy man and he's off to do a tasting, and so he has slipped away with apology. But I'll ask instead Michael Fridjhon the question I would have asked Bennie, and that's a very simple one. What would Duimpie have made of this wine if you'd poured him a glass last week?
I think he would have looked at it and there would have been a kind of slow and thoughtful smile that would have crossed his kind of face, and he would have said, sometimes the old timers knew what they were doing and why. He was never one to object to how the industry evolved, but I think he was firmly grounded in an era of quite old-fashioned integrity, which is what the early 60s were. You weren't expected to make any serious disclosure on your labels. There was no wine and spirit board. There was no wine of origin scheme. There was no wine certification. And so in a one way, winemakers had a lot of freedom to operate. On the other hand, they had limited fruit sources, and they had a very clear idea of how to make wines that they knew would gel well over the sort of elapse of time. And I really do believe he would have looked at it and felt that he was watching a ship set sail with a destination far into the future, and certainly a wine that will give pleasure to people 60 years from now.
Well, we have this history in a bottle for Duimpie Bayly, but that is not where it ends. Michael van Deventer, you did mention a little earlier some of the ideas. Just expand on that a little. This plan for an investment in a museum and a space that allows us to gather this rich South African wine history and give it a home so that future generations of winemakers, wine drinkers, just people with interest in wine will be able to tap into the life stories of people like Duimpie and remember them for the richness that they've given us.
Yes, I think it's still early days and things might change slightly, but I think the one thing that will definitely happen, Duimpie will be honored in a significant way, and it will be all about the wine industry, the history, but not only the history, also the personal stories. And, we've been realizing for years now that these stories, people, they're no longer there. And if you don't capture all these stories, they're lost forever. We've got Michael Fridjhon, we've got a Bennie Howard, a Dave Hughes, and many others that, can remember the stories, but not being more, but what if they're not there anymore one day? So we want to make sure that all these stories, the history is captured now. So that will be the project. The university still needs to sign off on everything, but we will be capturing these stories and the history already early next year, probably. And
you've got a great base because the Distell story is intertwined with with the stories of so many people like Duimpie, like Bennie, like so many more. And those stories then extend to the wine. And if I go back to the dinner I mentioned a moment ago, I sat next to Bennie and I just listened for upwards of an hour as he remembered so many people he spent time with and engaged with, but he also remembered some of the wines. And it's something I love about doing this show, how wine will often kickstart a memory or some nostalgia, allow somebody to tell a story. And some of the wine we had that night, the 66 Sonnenblumen, that tasted like it must be from the early 90s. It was still so youthful and so full of life. You have the opportunity now to take the liveliness, to take the essence of that wine and to translate it into some living history for those of us who love South African wine.
I just think I must just, I will be remiss in not mentioning that this project will be much bigger than Distell. This will be an industry project. And you only had to be there on the 12th of October, where we officially launched the Magnum, to see a room full of industry and wine legends coming together. So not only Distell, but truly wine legends from across brands, across eras, across wine growing areas. And, you know, that was the exciting thing. It wasn't just a Distell or just a university initiative. This is going to be an industry-wide initiative.
Do we have a vague timeline? Is it something that we're going to see in a couple of years?
A couple of years. That's one of the things that needs to be, but it's going to be sooner than later. 2024, 2025. But to be determined, but it's sooner than later.
All right. I don't often give people advance notice on questions, but I will, Michael, for you, before I jump back to the other Michael. I want you to give some thought. If I were to come and delve into the Vinotech or into the Tabernacle, the three wines that if you had a choice that you would pick and run away with. So think about those for a moment. Let's jump over to wine more currently, though, in the interim, and go back to Mr. Fridjhon. And Winex, Michael Fridjhon. There is a collective skip in the Johannesburg Steppe. South Africa's favourite wine carnival is returning, and not before time. And I'd imagine that excitement extends to yourself as well.
It's absolutely wonderful. That sense that, you know, every year for the last more than 20 years, come October was Winex time. Winex, which came out of the Old Business Day Wine Festival, which in turn came out of the Rand Animal Festival, would today have had an uninterrupted run since the mid-1970s. So it's the oldest event of its kind, but it's also the most youthful and the most transformed. And every year at this time of the year would be Winex times. The jacarandas come out in Gauteng. You kind of know that those multicolored posters will appear somewhere telling you that Winex is back. And we've missed it very badly in 2020 and 2021. We kept thinking, certainly in 2020, that hard lockdown of March, April, and May would mean that we would be ready to rock and roll come October. It wasn't to be. We ran an online show that year, which had the most extraordinary contribution from the industry, and the videos and the communication about their wines, that over 100 winemakers contributed to that sort of theatre of wine, still up on the Winex website. 2021, we kind of knew better. COVID wasn't going to go away that quickly, but now we are back with more exhibitors than ever, which is an indication of how much the industry has been kind of chomping at the bit to come back to Gauteng. And certainly if I look at forward sales, in terms of ticket sales, significantly more than in the past. And there is, as you can tell, a ceiling on sales. We don't want that room to be so full. We used to have the room so full you couldn't actually get to the exhibitor stands. So there's a real cap on numbers, and we know we're in for the most extraordinary return to a kind of pre-COVID world.
I remember the mass of people, the sheer volumes from previous visits. It was the first proper wine festival I ever went to as a university student, when the intent of the wine festival was perhaps ever so slightly different to what it might be now. Great to hear that there is that sense of ensuring everybody's got a bit of space, a bit of time to move around. But there's still going to be masses and masses of wine people out there, of wine exhibitors, of different wines for people to taste. Give us a sense of the scale of the number of producers, the amount of wine that is going to be on show at Winex next week.
Well, over 800 different wines, over 150 different producers. I'm sort of flicking through the names of exhibitors on the website, and it really is a kind of who's who of South African wine, from Buchenholz Kloof to Villafonte. Villafonte launches its Series C every year at Winex, and so the Series 3, I think it's 2020, gets released this year at Winex. Creation Wines, De Grendel, De Morganson. As you just go through that extraordinary list, you'll see Morgenstern, you'll see Le Riche, you'll find Leeuwenkale, Louis Vale, Le Bonheur. It's just one of those kind of, if you wanted the whole wine industry to put its best foot forward, you'd have to go no further than the pavilion level of the Sandton Convention Centre on the 27th or 28th of October, and see for yourself just how much fine wine and at what extraordinary prices is available to South African consumers in South Africa.
It is going to be a marvelous celebration. As I say, I will be there on Friday. Tickets also available for Saturday. And web tickets is where you need to rush off to ensure you can join Michael and his team for a quite wondrous celebration of South African wine. Right, let's see what Michael van Deventer has come up with his celebration. You've been let in. You've got 1 minute to sneak away 3 bottles before security arrives. What 3 bottles is Michael van Deventer taking?
Right, I thought I'd keep the selection with the traditional Stellenbosch Farmers Winery, where Duimpie obviously worked before he ultimately retired. The one is somewhat linked. I would go to a Nederburg 2 Centuries Cabernet Sauvignon 2012. Magnificent Cabernet, 10 years old, beautifully matured, and ready to be enjoyed right now. My second wine, this was a difficult one because I wanted to include Zonnebloem, but there's 2 really good Zonnebloem wines drinking well now. The one is a blend, the famous Zonnebloem Laureate, and it would be from the 2011 vintage. But I also have to put in the Zonnebloem Limited Edition Cabernet Sauvignon 2009. Right, so those count as 1. Sorry, I'm being greedy here, but it's already 3 wines. But then the last one, and the most important one, with a direct link to what we're doing today, is of course the Chateau Libertas 1994, a blend of Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and Cinsault, and still drinking absolutely beautifully after 28 years in the bottle. Those are the 3.
And I'm looking at the smile on your face. You're actually tasting those wines as you think about them and getting so excited. And the 94 makes absolute sense, because when we had that dinner in Camps Bay at Bovine with Pete Goffwood's dinner, and then you and Benny as our hosts, the 66 Zonnebloem, I think, stole the show just because we couldn't believe in what amazing condition it was given its age. But that 1994 was, I think, the silver medalist for most people as a wine that, close on 30 years on now, is just sitting in such a beautiful, beautiful place, Michael van Deventer.
Yes, I absolutely agree, and fantastic price point, available at Vinatech.co.za. But you can call me. If you don't like it, I'll take it back.
If you don't like it, I'll take it off your hands. I had 3 cases arrive yesterday. It's super wine.
If you don't like the wine, deliver it to Dan.
Let's head back to Michael Fridjhon for one last comment. And I'm going to ask you a similar question, but you need no time to rehearse because you're the oracle of all things South African wine, Mr. Fridjhon. 3 South African wines, if you could take them, not necessarily from the Vinatech, but 3 for you, and you'll probably think of another dozen within the next hour, but 3 that really stand out as the kind of wines that if Duimpie, for instance, were to take his all-time 3 best, or you were to share them with him, these were 3 that over the years just say something extra special about South African wine.
So I'm going to kind of play dirty and talk about those single bottles that have not only blown me away once, but every time I've come back to them over the years, I have simply been amazed. The one, of course, and I often say it, is for me the kind of Venice legend of the last, certainly half century, the 1974 Nederburg auction Cabernet. 74 was, I think, probably the kind of greatest vintage of the classical era, and Günter Brosel's 74 auction Cabernet is a totally amazing wine. So wherever I see bottles, I scrounge them, and it's a wine that is as complete as any you can imagine. Second, which is a strange choice because it's such a specific wine, the Lanzerac Pinotage 1961. In 2011, when Neil Martin, who in those days was writing for Robert Parker and now writes for Venice, was out to judge at the Trophy Wine Show, and he came to the old wine tasting, and that 61 Lanzerac Pinotage was in immaculate condition, and it forced him, he said, to recalibrate everything he had ever thought about South African wine, because he said, if that's wine that we were making in the same vintage as the great Bordeaux's of 1961, it's wrong to think of South Africa as a new world wine producer. But we were making wines that comfortably competed against the best in the world 50 years before, given that tasting was in 2011. And the third, which I'm not sure is in the Vinatech, but if it isn't, then I do think they should try and get a bottle or 2, but they'll find a lot of competition. And that's the 73 Canon Corp Cabernet, the first vintage bottled at Canon Corp, first modern vintage, and the original label, that color wash label. Truly an amazing Cabernet, not made from very old vines, but it has lasted unbelievably. And it's the kind of wine that I would, if I had large stocks of, would put forward every time to show the international world that we are not a young wine industry, and that the skills and our sites together give us a real point of difference in the international world of wine.
Well, that is a splendid selection. I hope you've taken notes. If not, rewind this and go through it again. Write those down. And if you come across any of those wines, if they have the stamp of approval of either of tonight's Michaels, then you're on something rather special. But a warning, if they like them that much, I suspect you're probably going to struggle to find them. Gentlemen, it's been a really, really nice evening with you both, getting to celebrate the legend of Duimpie Bayly. As I said, I got to meet him fleetingly, and just that brief moment I had with him left such an impression. So I know how much he must have meant to the both of you, and of course to Bennie Howard, who was with us a little earlier, who's dashed off to do a tasting, but gave us also some valuable insight into the man who Michael Fridjhon described as the most pivotal figure in the South African wine industry in the last 60 years. And if Mr. Fridjhon gives you that title, you've clearly done something right. Michael van der Venter, thank you for the time. Thank you for sharing the preview of the project you're working on. I know it's a big project. It's a work in progress. We'll watch it unfold with great excitement, and needless to say, support it with whatever we can. In fact, on that note, as Dan really likes wine, we're enormously proud. You don't know this is coming, Michael van der Venter, but we are presenting you with your very first item for the South African Wine Museum in Stellenbosch. We're giving you Michael Fridjhon. You're going to be able to keep him in a case, in the corner, glassed in. Just feed him a bottle of wine every day, and you'll be absolutely fine.
We'll gladly accept.
Michael Fridjhon, thank you. It's always a delight spending time with you, either over lunch or on the show. I shall see you at Winex next week. Good luck with the preparation. It is a gargantuan effort, but I'm thrilled to see it back. It means so much to so many people. I think it's fair to say it's been the gateway to fine wine in South Africa for so many people, and that status returns as of next week. So best of luck with it. Hope it goes well, and I look forward to seeing you there.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Dan. Lovely to be with you guys.
So there we go. Michael van der Bente runs the Vinatech. Michael Fridjhon runs South African wine to no small degree. And Bennie Howard, who was with us a little earlier, he dashed off, one of the great raconteurs of South African wine. And all three of them part of this project to create the Duimpie Bayly Memorial Magnum of Chateau Libertas, a wine that you really need to give a little bit more time and attention to if you haven't in the past, particularly those older vintages, but also this memorial vintage to buy and to hang on to and to just watch it age and develop and to see that Cinsault and Cabernet Sauvignon come together in exactly the way Duimpie Bayly brought it together in the 1960s for a wine that doesn't just age, but also showcases so much of the best of South African wine. That does it for today. A big thank you to George Karinos from Cyprus Wine Advocates, who've been helping us out today with our venue, thanks to load shedding in my part of town. I will see you this weekend, I hope, at the Pick and Pay Wine and Food Festival. I shall be there Saturday and Sunday. Very much looking forward to that. I will see you at Winex next week, and I will see you on the show on Monday evening. We head to the West Coast. The wines of Antonio Rupert and the Cape of Good Hope range will be broadcasting for the Vodacom Origins of Golf final down at Pinnacle Point, and see if there's any happy collision between wine and golf. Until then, keep drinking and supporting South African wine. Check out the Vinatech for a lovely selection of old South African wine, headlined right now by the Duimpie Bayly Memorial. And if you haven't got your Winex tickets, you better hurry up. They won't last long. Have a great weekend. Take care. See you next week. Goodbye. To join the Pick and Pay Wine Club, simply SMS your smart shopper number to 36775. It's absolutely free, and you'll get for yourself 3 times the smart shopper points on every bottle of wine bought. You'll also get a 20% discount on 10 different wines each month, a 25% discount on a case of wine, and a Magnum, some terrific competitions and invitations to awesome events.